Our best friends. The ones who are always by our side. The ones who challenge us and make each day better are sometimes faced with their own daily challenges. That's where we come in. Home to a suite of preventative, supportive, and rehabilitative products for your companion. Meet Help 'em Up. Its patented full-body lifting device provides support for injured and aging pets. FitPaws ensures every dog receives the care they deserve, improving strength, balance, and overall well-being. For visually impaired dogs, Muffin's Halo provides confidence and safety as they navigate their surroundings. And with Respond Animal Therapeutics Laser and PEMF devices, our pets find relief from pain and embrace their golden years with grace and dignity. At Paw Prosper, our family of brands help pets live their healthiest, pain-free, and most joy-filled days possible throughout their lives.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. Hi, Tanya. Thank you for joining me.
Hello. Hi, everyone. And thanks to Online Pet Health for the invitation and to Paul Prosper for the sponsorship. It's wonderful to be back. Okay. And I think we've got a little bit of a freeze. We're having wonderful weather in South Africa at the moment. And Anae seems to have disappeared. So she did warn me. So here I am managing this on my own. Today, we wanted to talk about mobility carts for canines and whether or not we actually have, what are the ethics around the mobility carts and what do we need to consider when we're actually going to use them. So what I want to say is if you are online, I'm not sure I can see you, but please put a whole lot of stuff in the chat so that I know that I'm kind of like not sitting here solo now that my host has also disappeared. Not to worry. She'll be back soon. Here, I see her coming. So
Can you hear me clearly?
I'm so pleased you warned me.
Well, this is a fantastic indication of how my day has been going. I've had a computer freeze, power outage, internet not working. My internet service provider is like, oh, but it's working fine on our end. So it's been a fun morning so far, but let's give this another try. Tanya, thank you so much for joining me. To those of you who are live with us, welcome. It's so good to have you. Please share where you are in the world and what your interest is in today's discussion. Any questions that you have, we're here to discuss them. So today we're talking about the ethical considerations in mobility cart use or wheelchairs or whatever we want to call them for dogs. And this is going to be a really interesting one that I'm very much looking forward to. Before we jump in, I just want to say a big thank you to our sponsors, Paul Prosper, for making this discussion possible. They are one of our Vet Rehab Summit sponsors, and this is actually a topic that Tanya was planning on covering in her summit, in her lecture at the Vet Rehab Summit. So I'm glad that we're going to get to go into it and chat about it today. All right, so Tanya, can you please introduce yourself and let us know what your interest is in today's discussion?
Okay, well, great. Hi, everyone. For those of you that haven't met me before, I'm Tanya Grantham. I graduated as a vet a long time ago and got into physical rehabilitation 15, 17 years ago. And I live and work in South Africa. And so, I've seen lots and lots of things change and develop in the field. And one of those has been mobility carts and access to mobility carts. So when I first started, I think we were just sort of having those conversations around how do we make them and what are the biomechanics, or what are the mechanics, not the biomechanics, but once you put the dog in, there are biomechanics. So how do we actually create them? And now we've got so much choice and so many companies that are producing mobility carts. My interest is always to pose the question with anything that we have available to us as rehabbers. just because we can doesn't mean we should. And I think the same applies to vets and anyone in a medical profession, and in fact, a lot of things that we do. Just because we can do something, the question is, should we do it? And so my interest lies in the way that we approach our patients with regards to a decision. And therein, I think, lies the ethical use of mobility carts. So we've got them, whether we want them or not, whether we like them or not, whether we use them or not, they're here. And the more we can talk about the things that create a little bit of an upheaval and upset for us or not, the more we can talk about those things, the better equipped we are to make decisions in the best interests of our patients. And that's what I'm about.
I love that. Thank you, Tanya. Hi, Charlotte. Hi, Barbara. It's great to have you guys here with us. So both from the UK, and Barbara, you're a vet nurse involved in canine arthritis management. So this is a very interesting topic. I think it is. And I think we should actually discuss, I'm going to make a note, but we should go into, if we're looking at it for arthritis versus, neurological disease versus, there are so many different spaces where a mobility aid like a cart could be used. So when would we use them? When are they indicated? What are those conditions that we really want to be considering an aid in mobility in the form of a cart?
Sure. I think we need to determine whether or not it is going to, why are we considering it? So from the outset, I mean, the original patients, I think that we really used them were neurological, patients with neurological disorders or spinal disease. The most common use in South Africa certainly has been the spinal dogs, the disc dogs. But as we got more information and they became more available, so the use of them expanded. So I think we do need to understand why we're using them. Number one, are we using them only for mobility? Are we using them to enhance quality of life? Or are we using them as a therapeutic aid? Because I've used them very successfully as an aid to therapy. But I don't think they should be a go-to simply because the dog is compromised. So I do think, I'm just quickly looked at Charlotte's message, I do think that we should be looking at, is it appropriate, or are there other measures that we can put in place? Do we have the skills to actually get this dog or this patient mobile in its own, independently, as opposed to, are we just going to put it in a cart because it's convenient? I think therein lies a very dilemma and question.
Yeah. So one of the first kind of.
Sorry, and having said that, when I say convenient, anybody who has managed a patient in a mobility cart will understand that actually it is anything but convenient. And it requires a great deal of physical input from you as the pet parent, or even from you as the physiotherapist. And I certainly don't believe it's convenient for the dog. So, yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I love that you highlighted those different reasons. So are we using it as a therapeutic aid versus a mobility aid? And is it adding to quality of life? So what are our goals, and then how are we incorporating it? And that's a really good point, because one of the first things that came up when we started using carts for neurological dogs was that you would bring it in too early and then they wouldn't recover function because they have something to walk for them. And so that was, I think, one of probably the first flags that came up for us, where we're like, wait, maybe this isn't what we wanted it to be. So I love that. And if we're thinking about, quality of life, how does a mobility cart add or subtract from quality of life?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think
what are
that's
our
going
considerations when we're specifically thinking about quality of life?
I'm going to give a little bit of a lag there. Yeah, I think that is, we can look at quality of life from a number of angles. So as a veterinarian, when we look at quality of life, we look at, has the dog got all of its basic needs, physiological needs, food, shelter, water, care, and now, mobility. So if the dog is not able to move and we give it a cart, are we giving it the ability to move, which brings us to the next portion of quality of life, which is interaction. So socially, mentally, emotionally, how is that dog managing and coping with its challenges? And how is that dog going to cope within the cart? So I don't think that we can blanket, we can't just cover everything or coat everything, paint everything with the same brush. We sort of have to go, okay, can we meet with the physiological needs? Number one. Number two, can we then meet the social, mental, and emotional needs? If we can tick all or most of those boxes, then we can start saying, okay, let's consider a cart. Yeah.
And this is very individual for individual dogs, right? It isn't something that we could just say this is the rule, because if you have a working dog, that, let's say a tracking dog, right, that does quite a lot of tracking, then they become paralyzed. One of their needs will be to continue to work in some form. Would the cart allow them to do that? Would it allow them to scent and to do some tracking, or would it prevent that? And how would they feel within that context? And again, so yes, on the surface, we would think that that could definitely be the case. You would allow them to continue to participate in their sport in some form. But how does that individual do it? And how are they experiencing that? Does it add joy to their lives or not? So I think that working dog question was one that came up in a previous conversation, which I found very interesting, because there are contexts where a cart would allow them to continue working in a form, in a way, and there are contexts where it wouldn't. So do you have other thoughts on that? Like if we're thinking about breed specific activities or sport specific activities, like really high drive dogs, when would we be adding and when would we be subtracting from their lives with the use of a mobility aid?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question. And my first thoughts would be, at what level of activity is that dog accustomed to? Number one, because while we can habituate dogs to the mobility cart, I'm not sure we can keep them in the cart all day. So it would take a great deal of management on the part of the handler or the guardian or the pet parent to be able to find a schedule that works for the dog. And that is a conversation we would have to have if we found ourselves in that situation. The second little sort of thing that is niggling at the back of my mind is we talk about working dogs and we talk about sporting dogs and we think they have to continue in the same manner. But actually they don't. Because what is possible, and I have seen it, is to give the dog a different job, one that it is able to do within that mobility cart. I mean, I recall, it's not so much a mobility cart story, but I recall reading about teenagers that had lost limbs. And in this instance, it was a 14-year-old young man who had lost one of his legs. And he was obviously all of the mental turmoil and the talk about I'm not good enough, and I'm half a person because I've lost a leg, all of those things. And please, I don't know what it's like. I'm just saying what came across to me in the article that I was reading. And interestingly enough, I don't know how the dog came to be within that group of young people, but there was a retriever type dog that had to have its leg amputated. And so this dog actually became an ambassador, and this but bonded particularly well with this teenager. But the dog brought forward a message about quality of life and enjoyment of life, even though we perceive, or society perceives, us as incomplete. And so I think we've got to be careful about, okay, so the dog is in a mobility cart, therefore it's half a dog. Well, the dog doesn't give a continental. The dog doesn't have the human association to, physical challenges that we have.
Yeah.
In my opinion. I could be completely wrong, but, so we also need to consider that, can the dog be happy with its new lifestyle? Sorry, I digress.
No, it's actually fine, because I think it is actually the foundation of, when we're talking about carts, is really, are we adding to the quality of life? How is the dog feeling? How are they living their lives? And I have come across only really a handful of neurological dogs where you can tell they're not happy. They don't want to continue. It's not working for them. When they become paralyzed, the majority of them really are still happy, engaged dogs who want to be participating in their lives with the people around them in different scenarios. And to me, that is, if they're happy, if they're living, if they're continuing to engage, then why would we not add additional support systems in place so that they can do that to a fuller degree at times during their day? So I think that is a very good thing to think about. They don't see or feel their disability. They see and feel and perceive their environments and their situation. And so how are we setting that up to provide them with the best quality of life that we can, right?
Yep. Yeah.
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 So let's.
Sorry, Anae, like we're focusing on the dog, but the other component that is really important for me when I'm discussing with a client the possibility of a mobility cart, or most of the time they will ask me, what do I think? And my questions always revolve around, what is your lifestyle? If you're going to leave that dog at home for 8 to 12 hours a day, I don't know so much if this is really a good idea, because it takes input, it takes care, it takes observation. It's not like the common misconception is, oh, well, I'll get a cart and my dog can zoot around in the cart all day. Well, no, because there's so many dangers in a normal home environment that they cannot be unsupervised. So, I think we've also got to consider, what are the capabilities and abilities and environment within the home? And how many other dogs are there? And how much care, how much time is there for care, and all of those things.
So let's talk about that balance between the time in the cart and the time outside of the cart, because that is, like you've just said, an owner will often come with the perception of, my dog will be in a cart, and actually they're only in the cart for a very small portion of the day. So how do we kind of walk our clients through that and help them to figure out how to create the best time outside of the cart, and then when actually to use it?
That's a great question. So I would start with, talk me through a normal day for you. What is the normal day for you and your dog? Because that gives me an idea of how busy they are, how much attention they pay to their dogs. Because sometimes, and this we also need to be astute at. I mean, I think we should have had so much more training, but we didn't. So, here we are. And here we are having these discussions. Is, do I want to put the dog in the cart because I feel guilty? Because if there's a guilt component on the part of the pet parent, then it's better to discuss that and deal with that, because otherwise what I have seen is that it has repercussions, and sometimes the decision is made not in the best interest of the dog, but the decision is made because I feel guilty. Let's say I ran over my dog in the driveway. May that not ever happen anymore to anyone, but it happens. And now I have a paralyzed dog and I feel so responsible that I can't make the decision to euthanize. And now I'm going to put the dog in a cart, but really it's for my own benefit. And again, now we start with, here are all the ethical questions, aren't they? Are we, why are we choosing to put this dog in a mobility cart?
I think that's a really important one to consider, especially with this question, because it is often for the owner and not for the dog that we're doing it. And I do want to say that that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes we can work with that and the dog can still have a good quality of life without unnecessary suffering. We work with the situation that we have, right? I was having this conversation earlier in that, when do we ever have a perfect scenario? We don't. We take what we have, what are the owner's needs, what is their motivation, what are their requirements, and especially in this case where mobility carts are involved, it feels like there's a lot more of that than with most other patient groups, that we need to consider their motivation and mental state in relation to what they need from their dog. And is it just a case of, they're not ready to say goodbye, or they're not ready to make that decision? Because again, sometimes that's okay and we can give them more time. Just how do we end up working in that space and in that situation so that the dog doesn't suffer unnecessarily? It's an interesting one.
Yeah. To come back to your question about how do I discuss it with the client in terms of the day, I kind of went off on another little tangent, but I start with looking at what is a normal day for the client, family, dogs. What's the environment? If there are stairs and steps, we need to be discussing with them. Okay, you got to think about, how is your dog going to navigate these if it's in the cart? And then we look at, okay, what is feasible and what is logical? What are you able to do in terms of times for that dog in the cart? So is it 2 times a day, 3 times a day? Are you home sufficient to put them in the cart every hour? I mean, there's so many variables with regards to that. And then what are you going to do? Where is your dog going to be, and how is your dog going to manage when it's not in the cart? So when it's not mobile, and we all know, I put that in inverted commas, because even though they may be paralyzed or they may be sore, if they decide they're going somewhere, they're going to do it. So there's all sorts of home environmental management, and all of those questions come into play before you make the commitment to purchasing that cart.
I really love that. So let's look at the mobility and the environment pre-cart, so that 90% of the day that they're not using it is still good quality, and then, or as best as we can, and then how do we add additional quality of movement to specific portions of their day with the cart. I like that. Barbara, thank you for your comment. So Barbara says, looking at the individual dog's needs and lifestyle before it became immobile for whatever reason. I've recently seen some dogs that have worked after amputation, especially assistance dogs. I myself have a sports dog, and I would have to think about his quality of life if he had an accident or condition that prevented him from participating in his sport. He lives for it. Although I would be happy as long as he was. I think that's. Thank you for that, Barbara. Charlotte, thank you for your comments. I worked in Thailand at a rescue, and RTAs are commonplace there. They have one dog there on a cart, and now they have 6. My ethical dilemma was, is that right? And the resources used for these dogs in a charity better used elsewhere? And is the aim to use these dogs as almost a fundraising tool, maybe? I think that's a very interesting point, Charlotte, because we're seeing more and more on social media, almost like rescue centers that have dogs in carts, and it's like 50 dogs in mobility carts, and that is an interesting situation to consider. I've never been involved with one. They look great on social media, but certainly it does raise a lot of questions. Yeah, do you have thoughts on that one, Tanya?
I could just feel the turmoil in my in my body with that, because for all the reasons that you've mentioned, is that, could the resources go elsewhere? And of course, if you're not part of the, sorry, we've been joined. If you're not part of the management committee that determines how to utilize those resources, and you think they could be used better, that is going to create a fair amount of discomfort for you, because that's coming from where you are. So whenever we're working with charity organizations, rescue organizations, I think the rescue organizations actually need to understand what is their goal, what is their role, why are they doing what they're doing, aside from the whole emotional aspect. And I think, that's a completely different talk, and I don't run a welfare. But I do think that there are a lot of organizations that do use certain of their rescues to fundraise. And the question I'm going to throw out there is, how wrong is that? So if they're using one dog to fundraise, with one dog with a problem to fundraise, and they're getting a whole lot more resources in to enable them to sterilize, rehome, do primary health care, whatever the goal is of the organization, then is it as wrong as you perhaps think it is? I play devil's advocate all the time, and we've always got to make up our own minds about these things. And we all come with our own, with our own values, but also with our own judgments. Well, if that was me, I wouldn't do it that way. Well, it's not you. So where do you sit now with this question and this dilemma, which is really what we're talking about, and so when I look, I've done a fair amount of work with a number of welfare organizations. How, for those dogs that are perhaps in mobility carts within that charity or within that rescue center, what happens to the dogs when they're not in their cart would be more of an appropriate question for me. So how are those dogs managed because of their challenge, because of their mobility challenge? Not just, yay, we have a cart and we're going to take as many photographs as possible and show how happy these dogs are, all those dogs on the beach. And, we've seen stacks of them on social media now, haven't we? So what is happening behind the scenes would be more relevant for me. And it comes down again to what's happening in their home environment or in their living environment.
Yeah, so really it isn't about that 10% of time that they're in the cart. It's about the rest of the time and what their quality of life is within that space. So yeah, I think that's honestly a very good place to start with our clients as well. Is like, let's make sure that the rest of the time is as good as we can get it. And then the mobility cart adds quality to mobility to the times when we want to be active with our dogs. So that's really good. That's really good advice actually for our clients. Another thing that has come up is this opting in and out of the cart, right? So if we have a dog in a cart and they fatigue in that cart, how do they opt out? How do they say, I'm ready for a rest? Is that something, do we want to actually put a cue to that? Do we want to just make sure that our owners are very aware of signs of fatigue? How do we educate and empower them around giving their dog choice of when they do and don't want to be in the cart?
My first question would be,
one?
it's so interesting because I've, in the last month, been exposed to such a lot of fear-free handling and, stress-free handling, and how do we even, as rehab practitioners, how do we even allow the dogs within our facility a choice? And now you're saying, how do we give the dogs a choice to be in the cart or not? And it's so interesting how our world has changed, because we used to be, it's an animal, it must just do as we say. And now we're going, how do we give them a choice? So again, I think in an ideal world, if I was prescribing carts, I would be going, okay, where are we at right now? And what does your dog need? A, what is the problem? B, what am I trying to solve? C, what measurements do I have available to me to use regularly to establish, is there still quality of life? Then ideally, I think that as a rehabber, the responsibility lies with me to educate the client, but also for the client to understand that it is important that this dog is conditioned to his cart. So that's going to mean that we need regular visits. And if the goal is for that dog to go for a 2K walk or a 5K walk, we need to work on a program like we would with any other patient of ours to move the dog to the point where it can do the 5K walk. Physically, can we condition the areas of the body that are working to be able to withstand the physicality of what we're asking? In that training, we need to be able to convey to our clients the importance of calming signals, body language, all of the ways in which our dogs communicate with us. We need them to be on board with that, so that on a day where the dog says, I've had enough and you've only done 2Ks, you go, okay, fine, baby, let's go home.
Well, yeah, and I do think that's it. If we can just recognize their signs of fatigue, then we're good. Then that can be managed well. They don't necessarily have to have opt in and opt out cues in place, although that would be great as well. My dogs are all barking at me to go outside, so I'm gonna have to let them out. But let me just ask this question from Barbara. There are lots of quality of life measurements out there available for both animal professionals and owners. How applicable are they for owners considering a cart? And would it help if there was perhaps a more specific or tailored one? Barbara, I really love that. And that's actually one of my own questions, is which quality of life measurements are applicable, and can we get something that's more tailored specifically to this scenario of use of a mobility cart?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it's really appropriate. And my suggestion, because we've got a number of quality of life measurements tools that we use, we've got a number of mobility scales and pain scales as well, which rely on mobility, a lot of them. My suggestion for everyone would be, which one are you using? And which questions on, which parts or portions of that questionnaire are appropriate or not? And if they're not appropriate, what can I add as a practitioner? What do I want to measure? What do I want to know about what's happening with that dog outside of what I can see when it comes into my practice? So I think we've all got the ability to adjust those quality of life questionnaires and make them more applicable and more appropriate for dogs that are in mobility carts. And what I would encourage you to do, seeing as you asked the question, Barbara, is start one on your own and, put it on forums, and let's start the conversation, because somewhere, some very good soul is going to pick it up, and then the research will follow, because that's what happens, or someone will collate the data, and then we'll be able to go, okay, here, this is what we think. In the end, these things are also all discussions. They've come out of discussions and things that we've seen, that we've required, because we weren't getting the information we needed. And that's the beauty of this profession, because it is so diverse and it's changing all the time. And there's such a group of amazing people in it who are asking all these questions. And then we bring them to a forum like this one, and we go, okay, so what would I add and what would I look at? And the more we have those conversations, and the more it comes onto forums like this, the more we can say, okay, these are the things that we really want to include. So for me, in the, like now, right now, it would be the starts of a conversation, and then where does it expand to?
Really like that. And yeah, and I think, as you've said, we actually do have the ability to create these questionnaires for ourselves. And I often think, on a patient by patient basis, they should be adjusted accordingly. So for this patient, what are the goals? What are the challenges? And can we put them into a questionnaire format? And can that give us a measurable that the owner can follow over time? That's something that I've been playing with a handful of my clients that have had specific needs that don't fall into just one category, is to create a questionnaire for them and make sure that we're making progress in those areas that are a challenge to that patient. So that makes sense to me in this case as well, is every dog in a mobility cart is different and has different needs, a different home environment. So what are the things that we want to look at for the specific individual? And let's look at them. So I really like that. Thank you for that question, Barbara.
Great question.
Yeah. So let's go back to, one of the goals is to use it as a therapeutic aid, right? So earlier we mentioned arthritic dogs or aging dogs or potentially amputees with comorbidities. So we're looking at more of, pain management arthritic dogs. If we add a mobility cart to their rehabilitation program to help them, what are the dangers? What do we need to look out for? Is it even a viable option? Is it something that you've used before? Because I have heard of it being used in that way. I think especially for amputees, you can add, you can make a difference to them. But it does feel to me like an end of the line kind of intervention where we're really approaching end of life decisions. Is that, I haven't personally used it in that way, so I'm quite interested to explore that one.
Yeah, good question. Most of the uses in terms of the therapeutic aid has been with, in my own experience, has been with neurological dogs. So where we've used it for posture, for some sort of gait training, for range of motion, can we get the limbs functioning kind of normally within that real framework? And And at the same time, because those dogs were so physically compromised, by putting them in the cart while we were getting them to regain mobility, was their mental, their mental stimulation and so on. So that's a lot of my experience. The animals where I have tried with amputees, I have also tried with arthritic dogs. And I think that my own experience with these dogs is that they're not willing to be in the cart. So most of them don't want to be placed there. And when they are placed there, there's almost a resistance. The question, is there an opt-out? Well, let me tell you that these dogs very, very clearly said, I don't want this.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, and we were working with carts that were not purchased. We were trying it out. So one of the problems may well have been that the carts weren't fitted well enough, which also presented the dog with the problem, right? Because if they aren't fitted well, then the dogs are going to have trouble moving. And then they're just going to go, oh, it's too difficult.
Yeah.
But the other thing that comes to mind, particularly with arthritic dogs and even with amputees, is that they have learnt a particular compensation in the way that they hold their body and the way that they move their body. And as therapists, we work with that, right? We work with those compensatory patterns and those tight muscles and, okay, can we shift you back a bit more or forward or to the left or, whatever we do as therapists that's appropriate for that patient. My concern about putting them in a cart is that they can no longer compensate in the way that they are accustomed. And so my question for those dogs is it appropriate? Because they're not going to spend all their time in the cart. So that's my one question. And perhaps that's why I was met with so much resistance, because the dogs just simply felt out of their normal pattern. And so they didn't know what to do with their body. So perhaps there is a way of training them and getting them accustomed to it. But as therapists, we have to be very aware of overload. And so my next question is, which arthritic joints are we targeting by putting the dog in the mobility cart? And if there is polyarthritis, what's the balance got to be in that cart? So I think we've got to be really, really careful when we're talking about arthritic dogs and amputees. How are we asking them to change their compensatory patterns? Those are my thoughts that are coming straight away. If I ponder on it, I'll probably have more.
No, I think that's such a valid point, because I mean, often our goal is to reduce the compensation and to gain back as much normal biomechanics as we can. But there are patients where they need the compensation, and we need to work with that adaptation to make sure that they remain functional. So yes, compensational adaptation sometimes is unwanted, but sometimes we do want it and we do need it. And that's a really important one for us to think about and recognize. It's not just put it in the bad box. We need to look at the patient. So I never actually thought of that, but yes, it does make sense. And in that case, is something like a help 'em up harness not more than sufficient to support mobility in the patient? So I think that's a good point.
And to add to that, if we're talking about end-stage arthritis or really advanced arthritic joints, is a joint replacement possible?
Ooh, I like that.
Because in actual fact, that would probably facilitate the dog in terms of its mobility way better than a cart. So, what other options are there before we put the dog in a cart? I think those also need to be explored.
I love that. So this is a great point from Charlotte. Thank you. So being a member of the forums of cart dogs, I often comment on, have you considered physiotherapy, etc., before skipping to a cart? I almost feel that maybe they have been given the impression nothing can be done before trying. So how do you combat that? As I feel my voice is drowned out by my cart dog is fine, and so will your dog be. That's a tricky one, Charlotte. What do you think?
So the first thing that's coming to my mind, Charlotte, would be before and after videos and testimonials of the dogs that you have helped, where people said, let's just put it in a cart. And as a physio or as a rehab practitioner, you have been able to get that dog mobile again. Because those kinds of visual things speak louder than your voice ever will. So that would be one of my thought processes, is how much and what testimonials do you have available to you to actually share on these forums, so that people can see. And you know, the other thing that I would say to you with regards to that when you're on these forums is, number one, people don't know what they don't know, and so don't keep quiet about it simply because you feel like your voice is being drowned out. And number two, what you are working against is a person who has a very narrow-minded opinion about their dog. And just because their dog was fine, and you don't even know how fine that is, transposing that onto another dog, as we've just seen in this entire discussion, is irrelevant, because every dog is an individual. So I'm sorry I don't have a straightforward answer for you, but those are some of my thoughts with regards to your question. But don't keep quiet. I mean, keep on speaking up in the forums.
Yeah, and I mean, I think if people are in a forum like that, does it provide education, or does it only provide conversation? Because a forum that's only providing conversation between owners, there's really limited value there, right? They can only really learn from one another's experience. And in the case of carts, no two dogs are the same, and they need to be considered separately. So providing education within that space could be a really good way to start shifting some people's minds. And I do also think that the people who are asking questions or questioning, they're not necessarily the ones that are asking those questions out loud. They're not necessarily putting their voices and their doubts and their concerns onto the forum. They're watching and listening and looking for those answers. So I agree, you should be continuing to speak up and sharing that information. And I would think that any way that you can bring it out of the comments thread of a specific patient and into more of an educational resource, that would make sense to me, so that it's not biased or specific to a dog. It's more generalized. These are the considerations we need to look at. These are the different things we need to weigh up. Watch out for. Are you looking for signs of fatigue? What is the 90% of your dog's day look like versus the 10% in the cart? And the more that they can see that kind of information come out, the more educated choices they'll make. That would be my thought on that one. Ooh, Barbara, thank you for that. So continuing from Charlotte's comment about physios, etc., surely most, if not all, dogs in a cart would benefit from physio or some other complementary therapy to support them. We're always referring to multimodal management in dogs with arthritis, but not one therapy alone, a combination of meds, home and exercise modifications, as well as physio, hydro, etc. I mean, I don't think any dog should be in a cart without support, but I do think it is the reality for a lot of dogs when their owners are kind of making the decision for themselves. How do we change that perception? How do we work with the mobility cart companies and say, hey, please don't sell these without support, so that the dogs can have the best possible outcome? maybe that is a good idea. Like, work with the cart companies to make sure they're not just selling them. I don't know. What do you think, Tanya?
I think, Barbara, you're absolutely right. And I feel the same way about amputees. You know, we as vets, we just lop off the leg and, oh, the dogs are fine. But in actual fact, for me, those dogs should have regular physio checkups throughout their life.
Yeah.
Because of the compensations that they're under. So I think that the dogs in carts are no different from my viewing point with regards to amputees. And so where does that conversation begin? I think it begins on educational forums, and it begins on other areas where you have a voice. And we just keep on plugging away. The more we know these things, the more we share the knowledge. Where can you speak about this? Where can I bring this to the attention of not only pet owners or pet parents, but the same as my veterinary colleagues? I mean, I believe very seriously that veterinarians need a lot of education in physiotherapy. They have a lot of assumptions about what it is that physios and rehabbers do. And the cart is no different. So where are the opportunities where I can or you can share your experiences and your knowledge? Where is there a forum where you can have these conversations? Because it's easy to have conversations with people who say the same things you do. It's way more difficult to go out there and put your neck on the line and go, this is really what we should be doing. And honestly, this is really what we should be doing, is we should be going, well, actually, I disagree. Here's why. This is my opinion, and it's okay. And you don't have to be confrontational, but here's what I see. And here's what I recommend based on my experience.
I think this is actually a really good spot for us to kind of wrap it up, because one of my main goals with this year's summit theme of the ethical dilemmas that we face is to encourage you all to get onto your soapbox and make a difference in the area that you're passionate about, i.e. ticks you off. Like owners that have mobility carts that have not actually seen any supporting therapist to make sure that their dogs can cope with that, and that they have the tools to cope with that, because it isn't something that you should just be doing. So I think that this is I really want to encourage you guys, if this is something you feel passionately about, if it's something that you're seeing a lot of, raise your voice, stand up, create some resources, get the information out there, make sure that people are learning from you, and start bringing change to our industry so that we can see better outcomes for more dogs in all the areas that matter, like this one. So thank you so much, guys. Charlotte, thank you for your questions. Barbara, guys, thank you so much for being live with us, everyone. It's been really great having you and chatting with you. Again, thank you to Paul Prosper for joining us at the summit and for joining us again here today. It's actually really great working with you. They have a mobility cart company, Canine Carts, as well as loads of other companies, FitPaws, Help 'em Up Harness, a few others that are really great for these patients. So if you're a professional, check them out and potentially use some of their products because they're awesome. Tanya, thank you so much for being here with us today, for joining the conversation, and for always being willing to have the tricky discussions with me. I really appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure, and I always enjoy them. And thanks to everyone who joined us live. And everyone who watches this later, I hope there's some food for thought for you. Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Yeah.